The morning sun barely peeked through the thick clouds as Grace Chin made her way through the private wing of St. Memorial Hospital. Her comfortable nursing shoes squeaked against the freshly polished floor as she approached room 2207. This wasn't just any room, it housed one of the city's most prominent figures, real estate mogul Alexander Park, who had been in a coma for the past 3 months. Grace had been specifically chosen for this assignment due to her decade of experience in critical care. The hospital administration had made it clear, Mr. Park's care required the utmost discretion and expertise. His family had spared no expense, bringing in state-of-the-art medical equipment and demanding round-the-clock supervision. As she entered the room, Grace went through her usual routine, checking vitals, adjusting medications, and recording every minor change in his condition. The steady beeping of monitors filled the silence as she worked. The room itself was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital, fitted with expensive furnishings and artwork that seemed out of place in a medical setting. While organizing his medical charts, Grace noticed something peculiar. The timing of Mr. Park's accident didn't align with some of the documentation she'd received. Small inconsistencies began to surface, missing time stamps, unsigned forms, and medical histories that seemed to contradict each other. Her nursing instincts, honed over years of practice, told her something wasn't right. During her breaks, Grace started piecing together information from various sources. She learned that on the night of his accident, Mr. Park had been scheduled to attend a crucial board meeting where he was supposed to reveal significant findings about his company's financial operations. He never made it to that meeting. As days passed, Grace noticed unusual patterns in visitor behavior. A man in an expensive suit would come late at night, spend exactly 7 minutes in the room, and leave without signing the visitor's log. The head of hospital administration would make unexpected appearances, checking on this specific room more frequently than any other patient's. What struck Grace as particularly odd was the absence of personal items in the room. Most long-term patients had photos, cards, or personal belongings brought by family members. Mr. Park's room, despite his wealth and status, remained eerily impersonal. The only personal effect was a worn leather wallet, kept in the bedside drawer, which contained a mysterious handwritten note she hadn't dared to read. Grace's curiosity grew stronger when she overheard a heated conversation between 2 board members outside the room. They spoke in hushed tones about keeping things quiet and maintaining the timeline. When they noticed her presence, they quickly dispersed, leaving Grace with more questions than answers. One quiet night shift, while performing routine care, Grace noticed Mr. Park's fingers twitching, a common occurrence in coma patients. However, this time was different. His hand movement seemed more deliberate, almost as if he was trying to communicate. She watched closely as his index finger traced patterns on the bed sheet. After several minutes of observation, she realized he was repeatedly tracing the same 3 numbers, 491. The discovery sent chills down her spine. This wasn't random neural activity, this was conscious communication. But what did these numbers mean? And more importantly, why did it feel like everyone involved in Mr. Park's care was hiding something? Grace knew she had to proceed carefully. Working in healthcare had taught her that rushing to conclusions could be dangerous, especially when dealing with high-profile patients. She decided to document everything meticulously, keeping her observations in a private notebook rather than the official medical records. As her shift ended that morning, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple medical case. The wealthy businessman in her care might be trying to tell her something crucial, and she might be the only one paying close enough attention to notice. Looking back at room 22071 one last time before leaving, Grace made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth behind Alexander Park's condition, no matter where that truth might lead. Little did she know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life but expose a web of secrets that powerful people had worked very hard to keep hidden. Her next shift would bring revelations that would make these initial discoveries seem like merely the tip of an iceberg. The real story was just beginning to unfold, and Grace Chen found herself at the center of a mystery that went far beyond the walls of St. Memorial Hospital. The numbers 491 haunted Grace throughout her drive home. After a restless few hours of sleep, she returned to the hospital, determined to understand their significance. The morning brought an unexpected development. A new security team had been stationed outside Mr. Park's room, their presence adding another layer of mystery to the already puzzling situation. As Grace approached the room for her shift, she noticed Dr. Wong, the head of neurology, engaged in an intense discussion with a woman she'd never seen before. The woman wore an expensive business suit and carried herself with an air of authority that seemed to command even the senior hospital staff's attention. His condition must remain stable, the woman insisted, her voice barely above a whisper. The shareholders' meeting is in 2 weeks, and we need him exactly as he is until then. Grace pretended to be occupied with her charts, her heart racing as she overheard these words. Need him exactly as he is? The phrase seemed more suited to a business transaction than a patient's medical care. During her morning rounds, Grace discovered that Mr. Park's personal medical files had been moved to a separate secure server. When she questioned the change, the hospital administrator brushed it off as a routine security measure for VIP patients. But in her 10 years of nursing, she'd never seen anything like this. While checking Mr. Park's vitals, Grace noticed something odd about his medication chart. The dosage of one particular sedative had been gradually increasing over the past few weeks, despite no change in his condition that would warrant such an adjustment. The orders were signed by Dr. Wong, but the handwriting seemed different from his usual signature. During her lunch break, Grace decided to do some research on her phone. She found articles about Park Industries, Mr. Park's company, and its recent controversial real estate developments. One project, in particular, caught her eye, a massive urban renewal initiative that had faced heavy criticism for displacing hundreds of low-income families. The most recent news showed the company's stock had been surprisingly stable despite its CEO's condition, which seemed unusual for such a personality-driven organization. As Grace dug deeper, she discovered that the company had recently acquired several smaller firms, all transactions somehow completed while Mr. Park was in a coma. Later that afternoon, Grace was changing Mr. Park's for when she noticed fresh bruising around his wrist, the kind that typically appears when someone has been restrained. But there were no restraint orders in his chart, and she hadn't seen any restraints being used. The mystery of the numbers 491 continued to nag at her. On a hunch, she checked Mr. Park's personal effects again. The leather wallet she'd noticed earlier was still there, but this time she carefully examined it. Hidden in a secret compartment, she found a small key with the numbers 491 engraved on it. Her discovery was interrupted by the arrival of 2 men in dark suits who identified themselves as Mr. Park's legal team. They asked detailed questions about her interactions with the patient, particularly focusing on any signs of consciousness she might have observed. Grace kept the information about his finger movements to herself, instinctively knowing she needed to protect this secret. That evening, Grace was about to end her shift when she overheard a phone conversation from the nurse's station. The hospital's chief financial officer was speaking in hushed tones. The insurance policy is ironclad. Once the waiting period is over, everything transfers to the board's control. We just need to maintain status quo for 2 more weeks. As she gathered her things to leave, Grace noticed the mysterious late-night visitor arriving again. This time, she decided to follow him after he left Mr. Park's room. The man walked briskly to the parking garage, where he met with someone in a car with tinted windows. They exchanged what looked like documents before quickly driving away. Back at home, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was now involved in something far more dangerous than she'd initially realized. She created a secure digital document on her personal laptop, documenting everything she'd observed. As she typed, she remembered something. The urban renewal project she'd read about was scheduled to break ground in exactly 2 weeks. The next morning, Grace arrived early for her shift, determined to investigate the key she'd discovered. The number 491 had to lead somewhere, and she had a theory. The hospital's old wing, now used for storage, had a basement level where patient records were kept. The rooms there were numbered in the 400s. But before she could explore this lead, she was called to an emergency staff meeting. The hospital administrator announced that due to Mr. Park's special circumstances, the entire care team would be replaced at the end of the week. As Grace looked around the room, she realized she might have only days to uncover the truth before losing access to her patient forever. What she didn't know was that her every move was being watched, and her investigation had already set off alarms among people who had spent millions ensuring their secrets stayed buried. The simple act of caring for a patient had led her into a web of corporate intrigue and potential criminal activity that went far beyond the hospital walls. As Grace left the meeting, her mind racing with possibilities, she received an anonymous text message, "Storage room 491. Midnight. Come alone if you want the truth about Alexander Park." The sender's number was blocked, leaving her with a crucial decision: follow this mysterious lead, or walk away while she still could. Grace spent the rest of her shift debating whether to follow up on the mysterious text message. As midnight approached, her professional instincts told her to stay away, but the thought of Mr. Park's increasing sedation and the bruises on his wrists pushed her forward. She couldn't abandon him now. The hospital's old wing was eerily quiet at night. Grace's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridors as she made her way to the basement level. The air grew cooler and mustier with each step down. Her phone's flashlight cast long shadows on the walls lined with abandoned medical equipment and archived files. Storage room 491 was tucked away in a corner, its metal door showing signs of recent use despite the dusty surroundings. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key from Mr. Park's wallet. It fit perfectly. The door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty hallway. Inside, she found rows of filing cabinets and boxes, but what caught her attention was a laptop sitting on an old desk, its screen glowing in the darkness. Next to it lay a thick manila envelope with "Proof" written in bold letters. Before she could reach for it, she heard footsteps approaching. Grace quickly ducked behind a tall filing cabinet. A figure entered the room. It was Jenny from hospital administration, someone she'd known for years. Jenny went straight to the laptop, inserted a flash drive, and began downloading files. Her usual friendly demeanor was replaced by an intense focus that made her almost unrecognizable. "I know you're here, Grace," Jenny suddenly spoke into the darkness. "You can come out. There's something you need to see." Cautiously, Grace emerged from her hiding spot. Jenny's face showed a mix of relief and worry. "I'm the one who sent you the text," she explained. "I've been tracking everything that's happened since Mr. Park was admitted, and I can't keep quiet anymore." Jenny pulled up several documents on the laptop. They revealed a complex scheme involving Park Industries board members, the hospital administration, and several offshore accounts. The accident that put Mr. Park in a coma had been carefully orchestrated. 3 months ago, Mr. Park discovered that his board members had been embezzling millions through fake real estate projects, Jenny explained. The urban renewal project was their biggest scheme yet, a way to launder hundreds of millions through construction contracts. He was going to expose everything at that board meeting. Grace's mind raced back to all the suspicious visitors and conversations she'd witnessed. The increasing sedation, the security team, the rush to replace his care staff, they're making sure he can't wake up before the project breaks ground, she realized aloud. Jenny nodded grimly. Once the contracts are signed and the money starts moving, it won't matter if he wakes up. The damage will be done, and thousands of people will lose their homes for a project that's nothing but a front. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an elevator arriving on their floor. Jenny quickly handed Grace the flash drive and the manila envelope. "Take these. I've made copies of everything. But be careful, these people have already tried to silence Mr. Park." They won't hesitate to do the same to anyone else. Grace barely had time to hide the items in her scrubs before 2 security guards entered the room. Jenny smoothly explained that she was conducting a routine audit of old records, but Grace could see the guards didn't completely buy the excuse. The next day, Grace arrived at work to find Jenny's desk empty. According to HR, she had suddenly taken an extended leave of absence for personal reasons. The timing couldn't have been more suspicious. During her rounds, Grace noticed subtle changes in Mr. Park's condition. His finger movements had become more frequent, and his brain activity showed patterns typically associated with emerging consciousness. She carefully documented everything while maintaining a facade of routine care. That afternoon, she finally found time to examine the contents of the manila envelope. Inside were photographs of secret meetings, bank statements showing massive transfers to shell companies, and most shockingly, medical documents proving that Mr. Park's coma was being artificially maintained through a carefully planned combination of drugs. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of emails discussing a contingency plan if Mr. Park showed signs of waking up. The clinical terminology couldn't disguise the true meaning. They were prepared to ensure he never regained consciousness if their other methods failed. As Grace processed this information, she noticed Mr. Park's hand moving again. This time, he was clearly trying to communicate something different. His fingers traced what looked like letters, HELP. Grace's heart raced. She quickly pressed the privacy curtain button, ensuring they wouldn't be visible from the hallway cameras. "Mr. Park," she whispered close to his ear, "if you can hear me, I know what they did to you. I have proof. Squeeze my hand once if you understand." The slight pressure on her hand confirmed what she had suspected. Alexander Park was fully aware of his surroundings, trapped in his own body by the very people he had trusted to run his company. Just then, Dr. Wong entered the room. Grace smoothly transitioned into taking vital signs, but she caught a glimpse of suspicion in the doctor's eyes. As she left the room, she overheard him making a phone call. "We may have a problem with one of the nurses." "Yes, the same one." "No, we can't wait 2 weeks. Something needs to be done now." Grace realized she had to act quickly. The proof she had gathered needed to reach the right authorities before the board meeting, but she also had to find a way to help Mr. Park without alerting his captors. With Jenny gone and no way to know whom to trust, she was on her own. That evening, as she drove home, Grace noticed a black SUV following her. It maintained a consistent distance, just close enough to make its presence known. The message was clear: they knew she knew, and they were watching. The question was, what would they do about it, and how could she protect both herself and her patient while exposing the truth? Grace took 3 different routes home that night to lose the black SUV, her heart pounding with every turn. When she finally reached her apartment, she found her door slightly ajar. Inside, her place had been searched thoroughly, professional enough to leave no obvious mess, but she could tell someone had gone through everything. The flash drive and documents from Jenny were safe, hidden in a hollow space behind the mirror in her locker at the hospital. But now she needed a plan. The next morning, she arrived at work early, knowing her time was running out. The hospital corridors felt different now, every security camera and every passing staff member a potential threat. During her morning rounds, she discovered that Mr. Park's medication had been adjusted again. A new order had been added to his chart, a powerful sedative scheduled for administration. That evening, looking at the dosage, Grace's medical training told her this was far more than necessary for someone in his condition. Her suspicions about their contingency plan were becoming reality. While checking Mr. Park's vitals, she whispered, "Blink twice if you can understand me." 2 slow, deliberate blinks confirmed their connection. "They're planning something for tonight. I have evidence of everything, but I need help getting it out. Do you trust anyone on your legal team?" His finger slowly traced letters on the sheet, NOTLAWYRS. Then, GUGHTR. Grace's mind raced. She had never seen Mr. Park's daughter visit, unlike other family members who made occasional appearances. According to the visitor logs, his daughter had been denied access due to security protocols. Now she understood why. They couldn't risk her seeing her father's true condition. During her lunch break, Grace used a burner phone she'd bought that morning to search for information about Park's daughter. She found several articles about Lisa Park, an environmental lawyer who had publicly opposed her father's company's development projects. The most recent news mentioned she had been trying to get a court order to see her father. Grace's research was interrupted by an overhead announcement: Code Blue, Room 2207. Her blood ran cold. That was Mr. Park's room. She rushed there to find Dr. Wong and a team of nurses already present. Patient had a sudden seizure, Dr. Wong announced, but Grace could see no signs of seizure activity on the monitors. We'll need to increase his sedation for his own safety, Dr. Wong continued, preparing an injection. Grace knew she had to act fast. In the chaos of the moment, she accidentally knocked over the medication tray, buying precious time as they had to prepare new doses. During the cleanup, she managed to slip a note into Mr. Park's pillowcase with her burner phone number. It was a risk, but she had to give him some way to communicate if he managed to reach his daughter. That afternoon, Grace was called to the hospital administrator's office. The room was filled with tension as she faced not only the administrator but also two members of the hospital board. "We've noticed some concerning patterns in your behavior," the administrator began. "Your unnecessary questions, your presence in restricted areas, your excessive attention to Mr. Park's case." Grace maintained her composure, playing the role of a dedicated but naive nurse. "I just want to provide the best care possible," she replied, knowing her job wasn't really what they were worried about. "We've decided to place you on administrative leave, effective immediately," the administrator announced. "For your own well-being, of course. You seem stressed." As security escorted her to collect her belongings, Grace knew she had only minutes to act. At her locker, she quickly retrieved the hidden documents but found the flash drive missing. Her heart sank until she felt something in her uniform pocket, a paper clip bent into a specific shape. She remembered Jenny frequently fidgeting with paper clips, and suddenly understood, there must be another hiding place. Making a show of gathering her personal items, Grace managed to slip into the old storage room one last time. There, behind a loose ceiling tile she'd noticed Jenny glancing at during their meeting, she found another flash drive. Jenny had prepared for this possibility. As she left the hospital, Grace noticed the black SUV was back, along with two others. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. She headed for the busy shopping district, weaving through crowds and stores, eventually slipping out through a service entrance and into a waiting rideshare she'd called from her burner phone. That evening, in a small coffee shop across town, Grace finally had a chance to examine the second flash drive. It contained not only copies of the evidence but also a video message from Jenny: "If you're watching this, they've probably forced me out too. But I've sent copies of everything to someone they can't touch, Lisa Park. She's been building a case against them for months. Find her." Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "I got your message. My father's nurse. Meet tomorrow, 10 a.m., City Library main entrance. LP." Just then, breaking news flashed across the coffee shop's TV: Jenny Chen, a hospital administrator involved in investigating financial irregularities at St. Memorial Hospital, has been reported missing after a single-vehicle accident. Police say there were signs of tampering with her car's brake lines. Grace's hands trembled as she gathered her things. She had to assume her own brake lines would be next. The stakes had just become deadly clear. Tomorrow's meeting might be her only chance to save both Mr. Park and herself, but first, she had to survive the night. Looking out the coffee shop window, she could see two men in suits asking the barista questions, showing her photo on their phones. They were closing in. Grace slipped out the back door into the gathering darkness, knowing that somewhere in this city, powerful people were preparing to silence anyone who threatened their schemes. The next 12 hours would determine not only her fate but the lives of thousands who would be affected by Park Industries' fraudulent development project. Grace spent the night moving between 24-hour diners and late-night cafes, never staying in one place for too long. She caught brief moments of sleep on public transit, always keeping the precious flash drive and documents close. By morning, she had changed her appearance, her long black hair now tucked under a short wig she'd bought from a late-night beauty supply store. The city library stood tall against the morning sky, its stone steps already busy with students and readers. Grace arrived early, scanning the crowd for any suspicious faces. At exactly 10 a.m., a young woman in a crisp business suit approached her, carrying a law textbook, a clever prop that wouldn't draw attention at a library. "I'm Lisa Park," she said quietly, sitting down beside Grace. "Tell me everything you know about my father's condition." Over the next hour, in the privacy of a reserved study room, Grace shared her discoveries. Lisa listened intently, occasionally taking notes. Her composed demeanor cracked only once, when Grace described her father's attempts to communicate. "They told me he was completely unconscious, that visiting would only disturb his recovery," Lisa said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I knew something was wrong when they blocked my court order with bureaucratic delays. But this..." She gestured to the evidence Grace had gathered. "This is far worse than I imagined." Lisa pulled out her laptop, showing Grace what she'd uncovered from her end. The urban renewal project isn't just about money laundering. They're using it to hide something bigger. Look at these geological surveys they tried to bury. The documents revealed that the land they planned to develop sat on top of a major freshwater aquifer. The renewal project would give them control over one of the region's largest water sources, an invaluable asset in an increasingly drought-prone area. "My father discovered their real plan," Lisa explained. "They're positioning themselves to control the city's water supply within the next decade. The displacement of low-income families is just collateral damage to them." Their discussion was interrupted by a library security announcement requesting all visitors to move to the main floor for a routine inspection. Through the study room's window, Grace spotted men in dark suits entering the building. "They're here," she whispered. "We need to move." Lisa led them through a service corridor she'd scouted earlier. Her legal work had taught her the value of preparation. They emerged in an adjacent building's parking garage, where Lisa's car waited. As they drove away, Grace noticed the black SUVs rushing past, still searching the library area. "We need to get my father out of there," Lisa said as they headed toward the outskirts of the city. "I have a private medical team on standby, but we have to move fast. Once they realize we've connected, they'll accelerate their plans." Grace's phone buzzed, a text from a nurse still on duty. "Dr. Wong scheduling comprehensive evaluation for Mr. Park tonight. Full sedation ordered." "It's happening tonight," Grace said. "They're not waiting for the project deadline anymore. They're going to make sure he never wakes up." Lisa gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I have a plan, but it's risky. My father's company owns a private medical facility outside the city. If we can get him there, my team can protect him and document his true condition. But we'll need help from the inside." Grace thought of the night shift nurses she'd worked with for years, people she trusted. "I know someone who can help us. But first, we need to get this evidence somewhere safe. If anything happens to us, the truth needs to come out." They drove to a small law office where Lisa introduced Grace to her most trusted colleague. Together, they created multiple copies of the evidence, setting up a dead man's switch. If they didn't check in every few hours, everything would automatically be sent to federal authorities, major news outlets, and environmental protection agencies. As they finalized their plans, Lisa's phone lit up with an urgent news alert. Park Industries had called an emergency press conference. The board was announcing the immediate commencement of the urban renewal project, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. They know we're moving against them, Lisa said grimly. They're rushing everything through before we can stop them. Grace received another text from her contact at the hospital. Security increased. Dr. Wong in closed meeting with board members. Something big happening tonight. Looking at the hospital blueprint spread out before them, Grace and Lisa began plotting their next moves. They had hours, at most, to save Alexander Park and expose the conspiracy before it was too late. The evidence in their possession could bring down some of the city's most powerful people, if they lived long enough to use it. Lisa pulled out a small device from her briefcase. This is a mobile EEG monitor. Once we get it connected to my father, it will provide continuous readings proving he's being artificially sedated. But we'll need at least 10 minutes alone with him to set it up. Grace studied the hospital staff schedules she'd memorized during her time there. The shift change at 7 p.m. is our best chance. There's always confusion during handover, and I know which security cameras have blind spots. They spent the next few hours meticulously planning each step, knowing they had one chance to get it right. Lisa contacted her private medical team, positioning them nearby. Grace reached out to her trusted colleagues, carefully sharing just enough information to secure their help without putting them at risk. As evening approached, they received word that Dr. Wong had ordered the hospital's security team to begin checking IDs of all visitors and staff, even those they knew well. The board members were taking no chances. There's something else you should know, Lisa said as they made their final preparations. My father's company doesn't just have enemies. He has powerful allies too, people who've been waiting for proof of the board's corruption. Once we have him safe, things will move very quickly. Grace looked out the window at the setting sun, knowing that somewhere in the hospital, the people who had arranged Alexander Park's accident were preparing to ensure his silence permanently. The night ahead would determine not just his fate, but the future of countless families whose lives would be affected by the corrupt development project. As they prepared to put their plan into action, Grace received one final text from her hospital contact, Dr. Wong preparing special medication cocktail. Claims it's a routine adjustment but ordered crash cart nearby. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. The race against time had begun. With evidence of corruption in their possession and a desperate rescue plan in motion, Grace and Lisa headed toward St. Memorial Hospital, knowing that powerful forces would do anything to stop them from reaching Alexander Park's room. The evening shift change at St. Memorial Hospital was more chaotic than usual. A minor emergency in the West Wing had pulled away several security guards, creating the perfect distraction. Grace and Lisa approached through the parking garage, their timing synchronized with the hospital's cleaning crew changeover. Grace had chosen their disguises carefully, nothing stood out more than someone trying too hard to blend in. They wore routine hospital scrubs with matching ID badges created from Grace's knowledge of the hospital's security protocols. Sometimes, she reflected, the best way to hide was in plain sight. Remember, Grace whispered as they entered through the service entrance, we need to move naturally. Like we belong here. Lisa nodded, carrying a supply cart they'd prepared with hidden medical equipment beneath routine supplies. They passed the first security checkpoint without incident. The guard was new, hired after Grace's suspension, and was more focused on his phone than their IDs. The service elevators were empty, but as they reached the VIP floor, they heard voices approaching. Quick, in here, Grace pulled them into a supply closet just as Dr. Wong and two board members walked past, their conversation drifting through the door. The paperwork is ready, one of them was saying. Once it's done, transfer him to the private facility immediately. No one will question it given his condition. After the footsteps faded, Lisa checked her watch. We have less than 30 minutes before they start the transfer. Dad's real medical team is standing by, but we need to reach him first. They emerged from the closet and moved purposefully down the hallway. Grace's heart nearly stopped when she saw two security guards stationed outside room 2207, more than usual. But then she noticed something that gave her hope. One of the guards was Joe, who had always been kind to her during night shifts. As they approached, Grace pretended to check something on their supply cart while whispering to Lisa, "Follow my lead." "Joe," Grace called out casually, "they need you in the East Wing. Something about a security camera malfunction. They sent us to do the evening supply check while you handle that." Joe hesitated for just a moment, but Grace saw recognition in his eyes. More importantly, she saw doubt. He'd been there long enough to sense something wasn't right with the park situation. "Protocol says we need 2 guards at all times," he said slowly. "That's why I'm still here," the other guard responded, clearly annoyed at potentially being left alone. Joe looked at Grace for a long moment, then nodded. "Right. East Wing security, you said? I'll check it out." As he walked away, he subtly dropped something, a keycard that would override the room's electronic lock. The remaining guard was younger, more rigid in his adherence to protocol. "I need to see authorization for supply check," he demanded. Lisa stepped forward, channeling years of courtroom confidence. "Of course. I have the forms right here." She made a show of searching through papers on the cart while Grace positioned herself near the guard. When the guard leaned forward to check the papers, Grace moved with the speed and precision of someone who had administered thousands of injections. The sedative, the same one they'd been using on Mr. Park, though in a much smaller dose, worked quickly. They caught the guard before he could fall and made it look like he had dozed off in his chair. Inside room 2207, they found Alexander Park seemingly unconscious but with slightly elevated vital signs. He was fighting the sedation. Lisa rushed to her father's side while Grace quickly locked the door and began setting up their monitoring equipment. "Dad, it's Lisa," she whispered, gripping his hand. "If you can hear me, squeeze once." Tears filled her eyes when she felt a weak pressure on her fingers. Grace worked rapidly, connecting the mobile EEG monitor while Lisa documented everything with her phone's camera. "The readings are clear," Grace announced. "The sedation levels are far beyond what's medically necessary. This is proof they're keeping him under artificially." Suddenly, their phones buzzed simultaneously, a message from their hospital contact, Dr. Wong returning with transfer team. 5 minutes. They worked faster, gathering their evidence. Lisa pulled out a small video camera. "Dad, we're going to record this. Blink twice if you understand everything that's been happening. We need proof you're conscious." The video captured Mr. Park's clear, deliberate blinks and eye movements, irrefutable evidence of consciousness and comprehension. Grace quickly sent the footage to their secure cloud storage. Just then, they heard voices in the hallway. "Why is Officer Stevens sleeping? Where's Joe?" The door handle jiggled. "Get this door open now." Grace and Lisa shared a look of determination. They had the evidence, but now they needed to get out, and take Mr. Park with them. Their backup plan was already in motion, but they needed to buy time. Grace quickly adjusted Mr. Park's replacing the sedative with saline. "This will help him wake up faster, but we need at least 10 minutes, she explained. The pounding on the door grew louder. Through the window, they could see Dr. Wong speaking urgently into his phone, while security tried to override the lock. They had positioned a crash cart to block the door, but it wouldn't hold for long. Lisa pulled out her phone and pressed a single button. Immediately, alarms began blaring throughout the hospital, a false fire alert in multiple locations, triggered by their allies in the building. The hallway erupted into chaos as evacuation protocols kicked in. Phase 2, Lisa nodded to Grace. Right on cue, they heard sirens approaching, not just ambulances, but police cars. Lisa's legal team had finally gathered enough evidence to secure an emergency court order. Mr. Park's fingers began moving more deliberately as the sedatives wore off. He traced letters on the bed sheet, TRUSTVAULT. "The evidence you needed was in your vault all along?" Lisa asked. Her father blinked once for yes. The door lock finally gave way, but instead of hospital security, federal agents poured in, followed by state police. Dr. Wong and the board members were already in handcuffs in the hallway, their faces pale with shock. Grace watched as Lisa's private medical team took over her father's care, properly documenting his condition. Outside the window, news vans were arriving, their lights illuminating the growing crowd below. The truth was finally coming to light. But their victory celebration was cut short by an urgent reminder: Jenny was still missing, and some board members were still unaccounted for. As the chaos of arrests and media coverage grew, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Somewhere in the city, those who had orchestrated this conspiracy were preparing their countermove, and Jenny's life might depend on what they did next. Lisa seemed to read her thoughts. "We're not done," she said firmly. "Dad's safe now, but we need to find Jenny and make sure every person involved in this faces justice." Through the window, they could see more black SUVs arriving, but these weren't hospital security. Federal agents in tactical gear were securing the building. The night was far from over, and the real war for justice was just beginning. The next few hours at St. Memorial Hospital were a whirlwind of activity. Federal agents conducted interviews while forensics teams collected evidence from Mr. Park's room and the hospital servers. Grace watched as Lisa coordinated with both law enforcement and her legal team, her father now safely under protection at a secure medical facility. But Grace couldn't focus on their victory. Her mind kept returning to Jenny's last known locations, trying to piece together any clues about where she might be held. The car accident had been staged. Traffic cameras had caught glimpses of Jenny's car being followed by a dark sedan before it went off the road, but the sedan's license plates were untraceable. "We found something," a federal agent approached them, holding a tablet. Security footage from the hospital parking garage on the night Miss Chun disappeared. Watch the bottom right corner. The grainy footage showed Jenny being forced into a car by two men. Before the car pulled away, Jenny had managed to drop something that glinted in the garage's fluorescent lights. The agents had already searched the area but found nothing. "Wait," Grace leaned closer to the screen. "I know that parking spot. It's near a drainage grate." Jenny used to joke that she always avoided parking there because she'd once lost an earring down that drain. A team was dispatched immediately. 20 minutes later, they returned with a small USB drive in an evidence bag, waterproofed and wrapped in duct tape. Jenny had planned ahead, creating an insurance policy of her own. The drive contained GPS coordinates and time-stamped photos. Jenny had been tracking board members' movements for weeks, documenting their meetings at various properties owned by shell companies. One location appeared repeatedly, an abandoned medical supplies warehouse on the outskirts of town. "That's got to be where they're holding her," Grace insisted. "These photos show the same cars that followed her going in and out of that facility." Lisa studied the building's blueprint on her laptop. "The warehouse is owned by a subsidiary of one of the shell companies we uncovered. It's supposed to be empty, but satellite imagery shows regular activity there over the past month." As they planned their next move, Mr. Park's private doctor called with an update. The reduced sedation was working, he was becoming more alert and had managed to write a series of numbers and letters that appeared to be access codes to his private records. "Dad never trusted electronic storage for his most sensitive files," Lisa explained. "He kept everything in a hidden safe at his estate. These codes will give us access to the complete paper trail of the board's corruption." But before they could act on this information, Grace's phone lit up with an anonymous text: "Want to save Jenny? Come alone to the warehouse. You have 1 hour. No police, or she dies." Grace showed the message to Lisa and the federal agents. They quickly formulated a plan. The agents would maintain their distance but establish a perimeter around the warehouse. Lisa's private security team, experienced in extraction operations, would provide backup. "I'm going with you," Lisa insisted. "They're expecting you alone, but they don't know what I look like. I can pose as a lost driver asking for directions, it'll give us an extra set of eyes inside." Grace agreed, knowing time was running out. They equipped themselves with hidden cameras and tracking devices, coordinating with the federal team. The plan was simple but risky. Grace would present herself as instructed while Lisa and the teams got into position. The warehouse loomed dark and imposing against the night sky. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she approached the main entrance, but her voice was steady when she called out, "I'm here. I came alone. Like you asked." The door creaked open, and she was quickly ushered inside by two men in suits, the same ones from the hospital security footage. They led her to a large storage room where Jenny sat tied to a chair, looking bruised but alert. "Grace, you shouldn't have come," Jenny called out, earning a sharp warning from one of her guards. "The evidence," the taller guard demanded. "Hand over everything you have, including the backup drives." Grace noticed Jenny's slight head shake, a warning. Following her gaze, Grace spotted movement in the shadows. More guards were hidden around the room, and through a partially open door, she glimpsed computer screens showing security camera feeds. Just then, a familiar voice echoed through the warehouse. "Did you really think we'd let this all fall apart so easily?" The hospital's chief administrator stepped into view, along with two board members who had escaped the initial arrests. "We've spent years planning this," one of the board members sneered. "The water rights alone are worth billions. A few lost lives are nothing compared to what's at stake." What they didn't know was that every word was being transmitted to the teams outside. Grace just needed to keep them talking while Lisa's team got into position. "It won't work," she said firmly. "Mr. Park is awake now. His testimony alone will bring down your entire operation." "Alexander Park won't be testifying anywhere," the administrator smiled coldly. "Did you really think we only had people at one hospital? The private facility where you moved him, let's just say they've had a change in management." Grace's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composure. What the administrator didn't know was that this possibility had been anticipated. Mr. Park had been moved again immediately after his initial transfer, with only Lisa and federal agents knowing his true location. Suddenly, the warehouse's lights went out. In the confusion that followed, Grace heard Lisa's voice through her hidden earpiece, "Now." The next few minutes were chaos. Federal agents breached the warehouse from multiple entry points while Lisa's security team created diversions outside. Grace dove for cover, making her way to Jenny. As flashlights and laser sights crisscrossed the darkness, the administrator and board members tried to flee but found every exit blocked. Their own security personnel, realizing they were outmatched, began surrendering. Grace worked quickly to free Jenny, who was already providing agents with details about other conspirators still at large. "They have more facilities," she revealed. "This goes deeper than just one city's water supply. They're trying to control water rights across the entire region." As the dust settled and arrests were made, Grace's phone rang. It was Mr. Park's doctor. Despite the administrator's threats, her patient was safe and continuing to improve. More importantly, he was ready to provide official testimony about everything he had uncovered. But their victory celebration would have to wait. Jenny's revelations about other facilities meant their fight wasn't over. Somewhere out there, more conspirators were preparing to execute similar plans in other cities. The evidence they had gathered here would help, but they needed to move quickly before anyone else could be hurt. Lisa joined them, already coordinating with federal authorities to expand their investigation. "We've only scratched the surface," she said grimly. "Dad's files will help us identify more targets, but we need to be careful. These people are desperate now, and desperate people are the most dangerous." Grace looked at Jenny's bruised but determined face, then at Lisa's fierce expression, and knew that despite their success tonight, dawn would bring new challenges. The truth about the water rights conspiracy was finally coming to light, but the bigger battle for justice was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Grace sat in the front row of a packed courthouse, watching as the former hospital administrator and board members faced justice. The evidence from Mr. Park's hidden safe had proven devastating, detailed records of not just the water rights scheme, but years of corruption that had affected communities across multiple states. Mr. Park himself sat nearby, still recovering but alert and determined. His testimony had been crucial in connecting all the pieces of the conspiracy. The attempted murder charges, combined with the environmental crimes and financial fraud, meant the conspirators faced decades in prison. Grace thought back to the whirlwind of events that had followed the warehouse raid. Federal investigations had uncovered similar schemes in 3 other cities, all targeting crucial water sources under the guise of urban development. Jenny's meticulous documentation had helped authorities freeze billions in assets and prevent the displacement of thousands of families. "The jury has reached a verdict," the judge announced, bringing Grace back to the present moment. As the guilty verdicts were read out, one by one, Grace felt Lisa's hand squeeze her arm. They had done it. But more importantly, their actions had sparked a nationwide investigation into corporate water rights manipulation. After the court session, they gathered in Mr. Park's private office at his estate. The room had become their unofficial headquarters during the past weeks, as they worked to ensure every aspect of the conspiracy was exposed and addressed. "I've been thinking," Mr. Park said, his voice stronger now though still bearing traces of his ordeal. "We can't just stop at exposing the corruption. We need to make sure this never happens again." He shared his plan, a new initiative that would transform the contested land into a public water conservation project. Instead of luxury developments, the area would house environmental research facilities and public green spaces, ensuring the water source remained protected and accessible to all communities. "But that's just the beginning," Lisa added, spreading out maps on her father's desk. "We've identified similar vulnerable water sources in other regions. We need to protect them before someone else tries the same scheme." Jenny, her bruises now faded, pulled up data on her laptop. She had accepted a new role heading up a watchdog organization dedicated to monitoring corporate water rights acquisitions. "We're already seeing results. 3 other development projects have been suspended pending investigation." Grace marveled at how her simple act of paying attention to a patient had snowballed into something so much bigger. The nurse in her had only wanted to protect one person, but that protection had extended to entire communities. The next day, Grace returned to St. Memorial Hospital, not as an employee, but as part of a new oversight committee. The hospital was undergoing major reforms, with new protocols to prevent patient exploitation and protect whistleblowers. As she walked through the familiar corridors, she saw the positive changes already taking effect. The VIP wing had been converted into a general care unit, making more beds available to the community. The former board's luxury offices were now a patient advocacy center. Ms. Chen, a young nurse, stopped her. "I just wanted to say, what you and Jenny did, standing up to them, it gave a lot of us the courage to report things we'd noticed but been afraid to mention." More stories had indeed come to light, other patients who had been overmedicated, unnecessary procedures performed for insurance money, vulnerable people exploited. Each revelation led to reforms and restitution. Later that afternoon, Grace attended a community meeting where Lisa presented the new plans for the development area. The relief on people's faces as they learned their homes were safe was worth every risk they had taken. Mr. Park, appearing publicly for the first time since his recovery, announced the creation of a foundation dedicated to protecting public water rights and supporting environmental justice initiatives. The foundation's first action would be providing legal aid to communities facing similar threats. "Sometimes the biggest crimes happen in plain sight," he told the gathered crowd. "It takes people willing to question what they see, to stand up for what's right, no matter the personal cost." Jenny's watchdog organization had already begun training programs for healthcare workers, teaching them to recognize signs of patient exploitation and corporate corruption. Grace would be one of the instructors, sharing her experience to help others protect vulnerable patients. As the day drew to a close, Grace stood with Lisa and Jenny on the hospital's roof, looking out over the city they had helped protect. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, reflecting off the river that carried the water they had fought to keep free. "You know," Lisa said thoughtfully, "when I was fighting the development project as a lawyer, I felt so alone. I never imagined a nurse would be the key to exposing everything." Jenny nodded in agreement. "That's the thing about corruption, it counts on people staying in their lanes, not asking questions, not connecting the dots." Grace thought about the simple act that had started it all, noticing a patient's fingers moving, caring enough to pay attention. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest ripples, she reflected. Mr. Park's private doctor had confirmed he would make a full recovery, though the psychological impact of his ordeal would take time to heal. But his determination to turn the experience into positive change was helping him process the trauma. The former conspirators' assets were being liquidated, with the proceeds going to environmental protection and community development. The water sources they had tried to control would now be protected by new legislation that Lisa had helped draft. Grace's story had inspired other healthcare workers across the country to come forward with their own observations of suspicious activities. A national network was forming, dedicated to protecting both patients and public resources from corporate exploitation. As night fell over the city, Grace received one final piece of news: the federal investigation had uncovered offshore accounts that would provide restitution to every family that had faced displacement. The community would not only survive but thrive. "Ready to get back to work?" Lisa asked, holding up files on other suspicious development projects they needed to investigate. Grace smiled, knowing that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a nurse, she was part of something bigger, a movement to protect both patients and communities from those who would exploit them. "Always ready," she replied, thinking of all the other patients out there who might need someone to notice, to question, to care enough to act. The sun might be setting on this chapter of their story, but it was rising on a new era of vigilance and justice.